The last dimension in the 21st Century Learning Competencies Guide is skilled communication. It consists of 3 competencies. Students use extended communication when they represent a set of connected ideas, not a single, simple thought. Students use multimodal communication when they use multiple modes or tools to communicate a coherent message. The ability to communicate in many settings with different purposes and to diverse audiences is a critical competency for contributors to a global economy. Communication in the 21st century takes many different forms, traditional and modern, and includes presentations, written documents, podcasts, blogs, emails, videos, and so on. Increasingly, there is a need for students to use extended communication, the representation of a set of connected ideas rather than a single simple thought. The nature of communication in the digital age also requires us to think of communication in multimodal forms. Communication also requires an understanding of the importance of supporting evidence for what is communicated and the needs of a particular audience who will be the target of communication. Creating opportunities for students to develop the 21st century competency of skilled communication requires a focus on formal communication that takes place during learning activities in all content areas. Communication of all kinds exists in any learning activity, but to help students communicate with skill requires careful planning. As we reach the first level competency, the activity requires extended or multimodal communication. Students are using extended communication when they represent a set of connected ideas, not a single, simple thought. As students demonstrate skilled communication, here are things to consider. Extended communication can be conducted verbally or through digital media, but there must be a tangible outcome that requires students to connect ideas they discussed. And the length or duration of a communication does not constitute extended communication. It is the connection of multiple ideas that qualifies a communication as extended. Let's take a look at this learning activity as a yes-no example to understand extended communication. In the no example, students participate in a webinar with a book author in another state, then ask follow-up questions. This act of asking questions does not require students to communicate a set of connected ideas. Students are listening to an author's presentation. However, they are coming up with questions based on that one presentation. When you compare the no example to this yes example, you will see a major difference in how extended communication is predominant. In this learning activity, students participate in a webinar with a book author in which they present a detailed review of the author's book, then answer follow-up questions asked by the author. Clearly, you can see that students are communicating a set of connected ideas in their review, then must continue to communicate in an extended fashion by generating answers to questions about these connected ideas. This is unique because the author is asking the questions instead of the students. This requires students to know their information based on their own research of the book and be able to be prepared to answer more difficult questions from the author's perspective. Pause the video to see more yes-no examples for this competency level in the guide. Another component of the Level 1 competency of skilled communication is multimodal communication. Communication is multimodal when it uses more than one mode or tool to construct a coherent message. The multiple modes or tools must work together to produce a stronger message than could be communicated through a single mode or tool. When students demonstrate multimodal communication, there are 2 things to consider. The first is student choice, because students should be given the power to choose modes and tools that suit their purpose in communicating the message, rather than being assigned a particular mode or told to use a specific digital tool. The second is student voice, because the purpose of multimodal communication is to construct a coherent message that is stronger than communication using a single mode. Student choice of modes and tools is an important element of developing the 21st century competency of skilled communication to give students a voice. Take a look at this learning activity in this yes/no example. Students produce a podcast on a hurricane for their journalism class, including a written script and the final audio podcast. Due to the fact the text of the podcast is the same, whether written or spoken, it is not considered multimodal communication. This is a no example. In this yes example, multimodal communication is evident. Students produce a podcast on a hurricane for their journalism class and direct viewers to a supporting webpage containing photographs that help listeners visualize aspects of the hurricane. Notice that the learning activities require multiple modes of media working together to add depth to students' descriptions. Students not only produced an audio podcast, but provided additional resources, designing a website containing images to understand information about a specific hurricane. Pause the video to see more yes/no examples for this competency level in the guide. Let's continue our journey to the next competency at level 2, where students must provide supporting evidence or communicate to a particular audience. Communication requires supporting evidence when students are required to explain their ideas or support a thesis using facts or examples. Things to consider when students provide supporting evidence are students must use a set of facts or chain of logic to communicate a point of view, make a prediction, or draw a conclusion. And any evidence students use should be sufficient to support the claim they are making. Let's look at this learning activity to understand the difference between the yes/no example. Students write a blog post showing a timeline of events leading up to the Vietnam War. The reason this is not an example of supporting evidence is because students are just stating the facts in a timeline. Students are not required to justify their choices using evidence. In contrast, check out this yes example. Students write a blog post showing a timeline of the most important events leading up to the Vietnam War and explaining how each event contributed to the outbreak of the war. Do you see the difference? Students are required to select the most important events and justify their choices using evidence. They not only state what happened historically, but recognize the repercussions of each event leading to the war. Students have to be selective in the events that are most important which caused the war. This takes critical thinking to the next level. Pause the video to see more yes/no examples for this competency level in the guide. Another component of skilled communication in the level 2 competency is students demonstrate communicating to a particular audience. To design communication for a particular audience, students must ensure that their communication is appropriate to the specific readers, listeners, viewers, or others with whom they are communicating. They need to design their communication to fit the needs of their audience, including delivery, style, and format appropriate to the particular audience. Students also need to understand background knowledge possessed by the audience. Let's examine this learning activity to determine if it is a yes or no example if students demonstrate communicating to a particular audience. Students create a public web page containing several ideas for improving a particular product. The web page is available to the public, but students do not need to consider or communicate to a particular audience. Therefore, you are correct. This is a no example. Does this learning activity look any different? Students create a public statement using a mode of their choice containing several ideas for improving a particular product. Then write a letter to the product's manufacturer advocating for these changes. Of course, this is a yes example. Because students have a purpose for creating the web page, they must consider the needs of a particular audience in framing the ideas represented on the web page. The choice of modes allows students to consider and attempt to meet the communication needs of their audience. Pause the video to see more yes/no examples for this competency level in the guide. As we reach our final competency of skilled communication on Level 3, students must provide supporting evidence and communicate to a particular audience. Remember, you have to include competencies in the lower levels as you move up in the elevator guide for each dimension. Communicating ideas in the 21st century requires more than mastery of traditional communication formats. Now, technologies are increasingly empowering people to communicate interactively more often, more quickly, in virtually any location, at any time, and with almost anyone, dramatically changing our expectations around communicating with others. Students who have opportunities to practice connecting ideas, using multiple formats and modes, and considering audience will be better prepared to communicate skillfully in the 21st century.